I think a lot of people have a stick up their ass where production is concerned with metal, and I think it's a little bit more of a nuanced discussion than people give it credit for, because a lot of times you'll hear people be on one side of a coin or another where it's just so black and white, and it's either you despise low-fidelity production and you think that automatically means the sound engineer didn't care and that the band is lazy or doesn't have the resources necessary to make a good piece of music. But on the other side of the spectrum, you have the people who think that hyper-sanitized production and very well technically engineered production automatically means that you are soulless, lifeless, and you're an industry plant that is especially trying to make your music digestible to a normie audience, and you're trying to sell out. And I don't think that either is necessarily true, because I think that both have their merit, and I'm about to tell you why. But if you're new here, be sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a like if you enjoy it. I'm coming from an interesting perspective, because I am a big fan of metalcore and gent and progressive metalcore, so I listen to a lot of very hyper-sanitized and cleanly engineered music. I also like a lot of hyper-sanitized death grind like Cattle Decapitation. But on the same note, I really enjoy a lot of very buried death metal and grindcore and death grind music, gore grind music, as well as shrill and brittle lo-fi black metal music. So I'm kind of coming at a perspective where I have seen both sides of the spectrum, how it's constructed, and also the critiques that people aim towards these two types of production styles. And this especially comes from people that aren't interested in metal and don't really put any mind or pay any mind to how it's constructed, so they automatically just want to say it's not good if it's lo-fi production. So I'm going to tackle both sides of the spectrum in this video. So the first being low-fidelity production, why it happens, and what it means for the constitution of metal. So low-fidelity production is basically just when you have something that is intentionally or unintentionally very lo-fi in the way it's approached. It's another way of just saying sort of homegrown, not having much texture put into it and not being manufactured that much, which all the time you're obviously at the end of the day gonna have to put a piece of music together. So no matter what you think is lo-fi, it's still going to someone, or it's still coming from somewhere, and whether that's a studio or recorded in your bedroom, you're still gonna have to mix and master it in some form or fashion. And even the most raw sounding black metal and death metal still came from something and they had to put it together. But the complaints that you see towards this is that it's lazy, or that it should be better produced, or that it's unlistenable. While I understand where you guys are coming from, certainly, a lot of times these are deliberate measures that are taken to make the music sound more raw and add texture to it. A lot of these bands and artists have sort of it in their lifeblood to make things that sound intentionally raw, and I want to emphasize intentionally raw. The funny part about that is, if you think something sounds unedited or raw, sometimes that can have just as much editing done to it as some of the more mechanically engineered things, because bands and artists will go out of their way to add specific effects or distortion pedals or just something in their softwares or whatever they do to intentionally make something sound more sharp, more ear-scraping, more ear-shredding. And you see this a lot, especially with noise musicians that go out of their way to make their music as condensed and claustrophobic sounding as possible. There's something to be said about the vintage nature that a lot of these bands and solo artists play around with. If you look at a genre such as black metal, that vintage aesthetic very much comes from the roots of the genre, and depending on what subgenre you're talking about, you'll oftentimes see kind of torch holding for the past, with bands and artists trying to revitalize a style by paying homage to it and torch bearing the stains of what made that genre what that genre was in the first place. So black metal, for example, oftentimes will try to live up to the distinctions of the 80s and especially the 90s Norwegian scenes, where they want to sound raw and they want to sound like they're buried and caked in this mud, because the bands that they looked up to, that they either grew up with or that they took their influence from, they sounded that way, whether it was intentional or not. And it can oftentimes play into the outsider culture aesthetic of some of these genres, whether it be black metal or death metal or grindcore, where you're supposed to sort of be off-put by it. And it's a way of gatekeeping people that aren't really interested in that type of music from going into it. So that rawness not only plays a role aesthetically, but it also plays a role culturally in making sure that as little as people as possible can listen to your music, that you are insulated and that you are just pushing everything else away. But on the other side of the spectrum, you obviously have good production, technically efficient things that are put in a studio, and you have that studio magic. This happens a lot with like metalcore music, gent music, progressive music, and that sort of thing. But it's not unheard of in other genres such as death metal, which has progressively had more good production put towards it, or things like Death Grind with Cattle Decapitation or Benighted. And even in the black gaze movement, you saw black metal start to get really good production with bands like Alcest as well as Death Heaven. And to not bore you, I will just say that pretty much everything that you could say for the opposite, you can say for this one, but just reverse it. People complain about how this is lifeless, soulless, there's not enough power put into it by just a person, it's not organic enough. It specifically comes from the more elitist type of metalheads that think that it shouldn't sound accessible, and they equate good production to being more accessible or being more sellout, and I just can't agree with that. And in the same way that lo-fi production can be a beneficial thing to the genres that it means something to and to the bands it means something to, you also have on the other side of that coin people that really do enjoy boosting their material up to sound well produced, well manufactured, and it in no way just indicates that there wasn't organic instrumentation put into it, that there wasn't talent at work, and especially coming from someone who enjoys sound engineering and mixing and diving into the mastering of stuff, that in no way is an indication that there wasn't talent put into the audio engineering, because well balancing something, EQ, compression, reverb, distortion, and everything else that goes into making a good composition from a metal department takes an insane amount of talent, and these people, just as much as the people that make the music itself, are coming from a background where they most of the time have been trained or have honed their skills for years on end to get to the point to be able to produce things at the level that they do. But basically, ultimately, what I'm getting at is neither is better than another. And whether your music is amazingly well produced, extremely shrill and brittle, or somewhere in between, you're valid. What are your guys' opinions of this topic? You can let me know down in the comment section below. I can't wait to hear it. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.